Today, Jeff Fort is 41 years old. At this moment, he lives in a maximum security cell in the basement of Cook County Jail, where he awaits trial for the murder of a drug dealer. But Jeff Fort's criminal history begins when he was just a kid. By almost all accounts, a strangely charismatic kid. He wasn't big, he wasn't educated. Never having gone beyond the 4th grade, he was, and to this day is, a functional illiterate. But Jeff Fort could do something his associates could not. Not only could he lead, he could endure. But in the beginning, he was just one of a number of leaders of a number of street gangs engaged in a war over turf. Jeff Fort's turf was Blackstone Avenue and 65th Street, where he grew up. And Jeff Fort's gang called themselves the Blackstone Rangers. When I first encountered them, they were a group of very young kids, maybe 16, 17 years old, the leadership. They were involved in violence with the disciples. The East Side Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers were the principal combatants. It was an insane time. Absolutely insane time. Father Tracy O'Sullivan was a newly ordained parish priest in the 60s. It was a very violent situation. I mean, shooting and stabbings going on continually in that community. Charles LaPaglia was a social worker at the First Presbyterian Church in Woodlawn.
A guy would get shot and somebody would say, well, he's an East Side disciple. And if you ask the disciples who did it, they might say it was so-and-so who's a Blackstone Ranger.
Commander Edward Buckney of the Chicago Police Department was a captain at the time. Had you as a police officer ever seen anything like that before?
No, never.
Officer Richard Peck, back in the 60s, was assigned to the brand new gang intelligence unit formed to stop what the gangs had started citywide, but especially in Woodlawn.
Racial change, economic change, cultural change, and whatever other change you want to mention, and it was happening very rapidly.
In the midst of that changing neighborhood, then, came the gangs.
They grew out of that turmoil.
How old were you when you first knew Jeff Fort?
About 17.
And he was how old?
About 16.
And the way you met was how?
Well, we used to fight each other.
Kenny Morrow was a high-ranking member of the Egyptian Cobras.
We fought against each other for 4 years.
But the Egyptian Cobras couldn't beat the Blackstone Rangers, and if you couldn't beat them, in order to survive, you had to join. Ultimately, 21 gangs would join under the umbrella of the Blackstone Rangers. There would be a ruling council called the Main 21 and a new gang name, the Black Stone Nation. Some would argue the P stood for power. The nation was 4,000 strong. There were some struggles over leadership, but in the end, it was Jeff Fort who emerged as the man in charge. Former social worker Charles LaPaglia.
I guess the overwhelming impression I have of Jeff Fort was that he was a very intelligent person, very insightful.
Police Commander Edward Buckney.
Our impression of Jeff back in the early days was that he was pretty much a pipsqueak, a sneak.
Father Tracy O'Sullivan.
Jeff Fort was a very powerful human being.
Former gang member Kenny Morrow.
For a man not to have no formal education and could lead that many people and run that many people's lives, I would have to say he's wise. We had more fear for him than anybody in the nation.
He was little, he was skinny.
A little skinny kid, but he carried big guns. 9mm's always been his favorite.
In the late 60s, it was bloody in Woodlawn. Jeff Fort's Black Stone Nation and the East Side Disciples were the reason.
There were 8 disciples shot on that corner in that year.
On this corner here, 65th
right
and Woodlawn.
This was the Gaza Strip. And
this was the Gaza Strip?
This was the Gaza Strip.
Which meant what?
To the west was the disciples, to the east was the Rangers that grew into the Peace Stone Nation.
And the disciples would come over here, challenge the Rangers, and 8 of them got killed on the corner where those challenges took place.
Right.
But it wasn't just gangs shooting gangs, it was gangs shooting other people too. 20 years ago, the litany seemed endless to then Captain Buckney.
I can think of a robbery where the victims were made to lay on the floor and they were shot. I can think of 2 instances of where persons were dragged out of their house, one out into the alley. They bodily drug him out of the house into the alley, made him beg for his life, and killed him in cold blood.
There were somewhere between 70 and 80 people killed.
In some cases, the actual killing in Woodlawn was being done by children, recruited by the gangs for little more than the glory of belonging. A former gang member speaking on condition of anonymity.
They wanted somebody shot. They'd give someone a couple of peanut butter sandwiches and jelly and a couple of dollars.
How old was that someone who was doing the shooting?
Maybe 10, 11, maybe 12.
Then, as now, there is a logic in gang leaders using children as killers. Commander Buckney.
What we found out was that Jeff and the main 21, they did very little of the dirty work. They usually put the 12, 13, 14-year-olds up to do the shooting and those kinds of things, because it was very unlikely that they would go to jail.
Jail was where police tried to put as many of the gangbangers as they could, but some religious and community leaders, like Father Tracy O'Sullivan and Charles LaPaglia, argued if people like Jeff Fort had the ability to lead and control literally thousands of young people, then why not try and teach him and them a better way?
Our position was very clear from the very beginning, that we weren't interested in being social workers dealing with all the bad things that they were involved in. We were interested in teaching that leadership to do positive things out in the community.
Our main goal at the beginning was to diffuse the violence, begin some positive alternatives, and to accept the reality of the organized structure that the gangs have and try to direct it in a positive and constructive way. And obviously that became very controversial.
So controversial that Jeff Fort and Woodlawn would become national news.